Speaker tonight is Dominic Etzold. He is a historian who focuses his research on the lesser-known stories of the Kaiserliche Marine. Did I pronounce that correctly? Okay. He lives in New Jersey, and between work and family life, spends most of his time collecting militaria, working on vintage motorcycles, and combing archival records. His first book, Reaping the Whirlwind, The U-Boat War Off North America During World War I, was released by Schiffer Military History in 2023. There are some copies here. His next book is due to be released in the spring of 2026. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dominic.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? It's good. Obviously, my first name is Italian and my last name is German, so yelling is a part of my daily life. A little bit background to myself. I'm a local boy, Middlesex County. I pretty much grew up in Seawarren. My grandparents lived in New Jersey. Growing up, I heard stories during World War II about my grandfather being able to see sunken wreckage off the coastline. That naturally sparked an interest in history. I went to school for history, and for many reasons, I didn't pursue a doctorate, but something I never stopped working on. I'm doing research every day on one thing or another. But World War I has been always something that fascinated me more than anything else. It may be less exciting in some respects compared to World War II based on the subject, U-boats North America being one of them. But it's relatively, there's a lot of unexplored avenues with World War I history. A lot of stuff that's hiding in plain sight that's waiting for somebody to research it. So I encourage you all, if there's something that interests you, to pursue it, because chances are it probably hasn't published, or if it is, the publication is probably wrong and antiquated. So with that in mind, I have two questions I want to ask before I start. One, how many of you were aware that U-boats visited the New Jersey shore during World War I? That's quite a bit. That's impressive. Okay. Of those people who heard that Sandy Hook was shelled in the summer of 1918? 1, 2, 3. Okay, good. We'll talk about that a little bit later in this. Now, if you give me room to talk, I could talk for hours and hours and hours. I know, so I'm trying to keep this concise so that we have time for questions afterward. That being said, I know how it feels to have a question in mind when you see a particular slide and then you forget about it by the end of it. So if it's something that's short, that's just a quick note, feel free to raise your hand and I'll try to answer it while the slide is up. So I chose this image to kick this off intentionally. This is a pretty common sight we'd see after World War II, after World War I, where the Allies were bringing back vessels, either as war trophies, stuff they commandeered. You notice the American flag here. The submarine there is U-117. It did actually come to the United States after the war, but that's a German crew and that's a German ship. So that was captured and they made it back there. That was part of their prize. So a little bit background for those of you unfamiliar with World War I. The United States did not enter World War I until the spring of 1917. I don't want to say that the United States was sort of ambivalent in the years preceding that. So you had August 1914 up to that, almost 3 years. I'm sorry, getting ahead of myself here. We weren't very ambivalent because the United States was basically keeping the Allies supplied with food, ammunition, and they owed us a ton of money. We could not get involved if it looked like Germany was going to win. That being said, President Wilson, who wanted to keep the United States out of war, he was very idealistic. He did see that it was sort of unfair treatment, especially with the British blockade. The British kept cruisers off of American shores in international waters, and any United States ships that left American ports were subject to search and seizure. They arrested a lot of Germans, Austro-Hungarians, anybody they suspected of potentially going home to join the war effort. They seized mail, and were generally, they would not let any food get to Germany because that would defeat the purpose of their blockade in the North Sea. President Wilson wanted them to say, well, you're doing this, we're supplying you, at least get some of the food ships to go by. And he got a hard no on that. It forced the United States to reevaluate naval policy. At that point, the United States made a concerted effort to become the #1 naval power in the world. It wasn't something it realized in World War I, but there was a big shift. We stopped developing cruisers. We started having huge naval spending bills in 1915 and 1916. In 1916, the Battle of Jutland happened, where we saw, all right, battleships might not be where it's at anymore. The Germans aren't really taking them now. The British aren't forcibly engaging. They're content with the blockade. And then we saw another shift in building destroyers, seaplanes, and a little bit more cruisers. But once they saw what the submarines were doing, it forced us to reevaluate our own naval policies. Now, prior to the United States entering the war, 2 submarines actually made it here. One was the U Deutschland. It was a cargo submarine. It went to Baltimore in 1916. It made a second trip to New London, Connecticut. It carried dyes, pharmaceuticals, a lot of high-end goods that the Germans are still known for making, and came back with raw materials. It should be noted that this was a celebrated event. Congressmen wanted to tour the U Deutschland. There were celebrations in Baltimore, largely German population. But we were thrilled by this. Next, U-53 came. Now, this was a combat-going submarine. They modified it quite a bit in order to make the trip to the United States. Under normal conditions, with a normal torpedo load where you didn't have water, you didn't have fuel in the ballast tanks, it wouldn't have made it, but it went to Newport, Rhode Island, to the destroyer base there, basically said, hello, you want to come in, you can come in, we can do this. They embellished the capabilities of the submarine. The wives of the officers toured. They had the cook prepare special meals for the children. They played music. It was all great. They couldn't stay longer because they would have to intern the submarine. They didn't need any help. They said, all right, hi, goodbye, we'll see you later. Went into international waters, past the 3-mile limit, started sinking vessels. The US responded with destroyers only to pick up survivors. The United States, being neutral, could not intervene as long as United States vessels weren't being sunk. In fact, at one point, Hans Rose, the commander of U-53, had to tell a United States destroyer to move out of the way because he was going to torpedo a ship, and it did. British were not very happy about that. Prior to the US entering the war, and just prior, the United States Navy sent Admiral William Soden Sims over to England to see what the situation was. He didn't like what he heard. At the point he went over there, Great Britain had a grain supply left of just 6 weeks. That's how much vessels the Germans were sinking and cutting off their supply. Sims was a bit of an Anglophile, as were most of the people in President Wilson's cabinet. This horrified him. So now he said, look, the war is happening over here. It's not going to happen in the United States. We have to send all our best naval assets over to England. All of the new and best destroyers, all the best crews, all the best battleships, well, really all the battleships. And it was a gamble because we were leaving the United States seaboard up to antiquated vessels, 110-foot subchasers, section patrol boats, manned by reservists, manned by naval cadets. There was a Yale volunteer air squadron flying seaplanes for reconnaissance. This was the sort of caliber of people you were getting. I'll explain what SP section patrol ships and the 110-foot subchasers really were. Does anybody have a yacht here? Yeah, I didn't think so. Neither do I. But if you did, at this point, you could lease the Navy your yacht. That would essentially become a section patrol boat. These were all different. There was no standard size. There was no standard armament. And I'll talk in a second about how the crews ended up. The Germans at the same time, once the United States entered the war, they had no need for these cargo submarines that could go 25,000 nautical miles. So these were converted to combat submarines. The U-151 class, they developed a large ocean-going mine layer, the UE2 class, I'm sorry, which became U-117 and above, and the U-139 U-Kreutzer class, U-Cruisers, they were a bit different. I'm not going to explain all the intricacies of these because we could go on forever, but if anybody wants to talk about that later, then really nerd out, I will. This is the U-Deutschland when it came to Baltimore. It should be noted, this is an American postcard celebrating the commander, celebrating the vessel here. As a side note, this Timmins company, the Eastern Forwarding Company, was a shell company actually run by German intelligence. They did a lot of other stuff in Baltimore we won't get into today. This is U-53 in Rhode Island. This was the commander of the station. He brought his family over on that boat. They visited. You have the other people here and a destroyer in the background. And now we get into what the Germans developed. So this is the same submarine as that. Obviously, there's no guns here. It didn't have any armaments whatsoever. Now you have 15-centimeter deck guns here. It did not match the rest of the U-151 class until later on. Again, something I could nerd out with. That's a U-151 class, subtle differences. That's UE2, U-117, an ocean-going mine layer. And that is the U-139 U-Kreutzer class. This is what a section one of what a section patrol boat would look like. This was SP, let me go back, SP-92, which was used by Thomas Edison to do research, anti-submarine research. He came up with a lot of anti-submarine inventions, listening devices, none of which were adapted. You can see here, you have small guns, looks like a searchlight back there. This is another SP boat. This has a Y gun in the back that will launch depth charges. You have some forward guns there. Again, if you owned a yacht, you could lease it, and that's what it would look like. Here we have a minesweeper. This is in the Delaware. This is off of the southern tip of New Jersey, off of Cape May. This is the Cape May base. You have a seaplane here. This is what the 110-foot subchasers would look like. And you have another section patrol boat here. Again, totally different than the two we already saw. They were all wildly different and variously armed. Here's what our destroyers would look like. You see dazzle camouflage here. It actually worked. We could talk about that later. And here we have U-117. I have this just to show the size. U-117 was smaller than the converted merchants and the U-Cruisers, but that's another 110-foot subchaser right next to it, okay? It's really not much of a matchup if these went head-to-head, yet they did almost sink one of them. As far as armament goes, every U-Cruiser, whether it be the merchant type, the UE2 mine layer, or the U-139 class, had a 15-centimeter deck gun. That's about 6 inches. And I just want to compare that to the 3-inch 23 caliber deck gun equipped to our 110-foot subchasers. Okay? This is a huge, huge disparity. The benefit of having such a big gun like this is you could engage targets out to 9 miles. Obviously, this, you had to get up to 5 miles. So you were outgunned before you could even approach it. So leading up to the war in New Jersey, we had Fort Hancock, Sandy Hook. There was no beach there. It was a fort. It was a set of forts in New Jersey and New York to protect the New York harbor. You had one in the middle of where the Verrazano is. It's no longer there. It's actually the part of the foot is the footing for the Verrazano, and then 2 more, I believe, in Brooklyn that were supposed to coordinate with this. If anybody's been to Sandy Hook and took the tour of it, you learned all about the huge steam guns they had that were antiquated by the time the fort went into service. Those were largely dismantled, as were the larger 12-inch guns. They were sent over to Europe to be used as rail guns. Did keep some smaller ones that were actually more suitable for attacking vessels, which I'll talk about later. But other than that, Sandy Hook was used as a departure point for men and materiel. You had active Army soldiers camping out there in tents, and you still had the test firing and the proving grounds active at this time, which will play into a story we talk about later. As far as the harbor went, there was a steel wire anti-submarine net that was supposed to go into the Ambrose Channel to prevent submarines from entering. This is only to be used at night. They were going to use the 110-foot sub chasers and seaplanes to patrol during the day. And then the actual harbors themselves were closed from dusk till dawn unless you had specific access. It was just a means of preventing the Germans from getting in. There was an obsession with the US Navy about troop ships. And I can't stress that enough, that to the United States Navy, every care had to be taken to protect troop ships, to the point that when soldiers were departing, people weren't allowed to wave, they weren't allowed to celebrate, they didn't want to bring any attention to this. That was not what the Germans' target was during this campaign. Forgot I had this one. So that's a U cruiser compared to normal submarines. These are close. These are UB boats, very small coastal submarines. This is actually what the Type 7 U-boats that came in World War II were based on. So you see the size disparity there. These? Those are wireless masts. Those are for sending signals and receiving signals. So here you have wires that would go up here to the mast. That's to prevent nets from snagging on the guns if you hit them. Some had net cutters. This one doesn't. It sort of looked like saw teeth on the front of it, but they had these wires that would stretch all the way up to here so that if you went into a submarine net or something else, they wouldn't get snagged on the gun here. That's why you see they also served as sort of a antennae also. So Germans don't need the cargo submarines anymore. The United States pretty much revamped their entire naval plan. Were we ready? And the answer is neither we nor the Germans were. As an aside, I told you I'd mention the kind of crews that you would have for these sub chasers. So sub chasers were actually built in New Jersey quite a bit. You had the Elco company, Electric Launch Company in Bayonne, making quite a few. They were contracted all through the United States, but we made quite a bit. And the Standard Motor Company also in Jersey City made the engines for these. But anyway, we have a story from a local guy in New York, Alexander Moffat. He wrote a memoir about his service with a sub chaser. He was a non-commissioned officer. I believe he was going for his machinist trade in the Navy. Had a very wealthy friend. Obviously, nobody here raised their hands they had yachts, but he had a friend who said, look, we should get one of these. We'll get a yacht, we'll lease it to the Navy. We could spend our days patrolling the harbor, hitting the bars at night, having a great time, making the most of the war. So he said, you think you could buy one for $35,000? So this is in 1917. $35,000, I just double checked today. That's $896,000, and as of June, it's probably even more now. So he said, get one for $35,000. We'll get a couple friends. We'll enlist. We'll just tell the Navy you're going to be the captain. You're going to be a non-commissioned officer. Well, the Navy said, yeah, we like the yacht. We'll lease it from you. We'll let you and your friends be the crew. The only thing is, if you want to command it, you have to be a commissioned officer. And he said, well, I'm not. I have to take the test for the machinist. And he said, well, that's no problem. We'll commission you right on the spot. And they did. So now you have Alexander Moffat. He's a sub chaser captain. He did not stay in the United States. He went over to Europe. He had to go to Bermuda first and onward. And he had no idea how to navigate. So his commanding officer said, well, just listen to what everybody else is saying on the radio. So if they ask you for your coordinates, just match it. And just as long as you follow the person in front of you, you'll be all right. And he made it. He did actually make it across the ocean, served the war, throughout the war. British intelligence in Room 40 was pretty incredible. We hear a lot about it in World War II about cracking the Enigma machine, but they had a team in Room 40. They were intercepting all the signals. They had broken the codes numerous times. They had captured ciphers. When they changed, they broke them again. So they were aware of just about every vessel that was leaving Germany. They told William Sims, hey, we have one of the U cruisers coming out. And Sims radioed back to the United States, Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels. Basically, don't worry about it. These types are slow. Historically, they've only sunk 30,000 to 40,000 tons. Make no change to naval policy. If they do come over and damage stuff, it's pretty much going to be accepted. Now, 30 to 40,000 tons is not a lot when we think of ships today. Back then, if you had a battleship, it'd be about 17,000 gross tons. If you had a steamship, a decent sized steamship, you could be from 3,000 to 7,000. If you had a fishing trawler, maybe 140 tons. And you still had a lot of sailing ships at this point, a lot of sailing ships. It's hard to think about in the 20th century, but most of the coal was being transported by sailing ships along the coastline. So they said, don't worry about it. We're not going to issue a warning. The 4th and 5th Naval Districts, Philadelphia and Norfolk, they canceled leave. They didn't issue any warnings because they were told not to, but they sort of wanted to be aware if anything happened, because the instructions left by the Navy said, it's up to you. We're telling you not to do it, but if you do it, we won't stop you. Almost shifting the blame in a way. And just want to read you what they actually wrote here. The actual instructions to the district commanders before the first U cruiser ever hit here was that it is most important that the public and ships not falsely be alarmed, nor that a state of mind be aroused, which would produce a situation more dangerous than the presence of submarines themselves. It is also to the advantage of the enemy that many and false warnings should be disseminated for the purpose of confusing and holding back the natural flow of ships. To prevent this, the promiscuous broadcasting by district commanders of warnings, verified or unverified, will cease. Okay? So all the district commanders were aware that at least one submarine was coming. They couldn't wireless any warnings about it because they didn't want to scare ships from leaving harbor. They didn't want to cause people to panic, which wound up happening later. So the first vessel to come to New Jersey, I'm not going to go into all the other places, but they operated from South Carolina all the way up to Nova Scotia, okay? For brevity purposes, we'll talk only about the ones in New Jersey. So we have U-151, that's converted merchant, commanded by Kapitänleutnant von Nossis und Jankendorf, this guy right here. So it originally was supposed to go to Chesapeake Bay, laid minefields. This wasn't using big mines. It was using what were called TECA mines, which was an abbreviation of torpedo caliber. They could be launched from the deck. They kept some on the deck. They had about 12 based on the submarine, and they could shoot them through the torpedo tubes to lay them. So they could do it submerged, which is why they were smaller. It was going to cut communication cables and sink any targets of opportunity. So it was going to move between Chesapeake Bay up to Nova Scotia and back. The whole time it was coming down, it was listening to our radio. And even though they actually engaged 2 vessels, which said, hey, we're being attacked in the mid-Atlantic, something's coming to the United States, U-151 was listening to the radio, and they kept hearing no submarines, no war warning, repeated over and over and over. So what happened? They got here, laid their minefield, immediately started sinking vessels, actually took the crews captive, so they couldn't go back to shore and announce that, hey, a submarine is here. They went up to New England. The weather was sort of bad, and they said, all right, we're going to go back to New Jersey. We're going to do our cable cutting mission, and we're going to start sinking vessels. So on June 2nd, what became known as Black Sunday, U-151 really went to town. I was talking about sailing ships. We're going to see some examples of them here. So the first one it came across was the Isabel B. Wiley. Again, 776 gross tons. You know, I said, when Sims was saying 30,000 to 40,000, remember, a lot of them are under 1,000, a good steamship 3,000 to 7,000. It was loaded with coal. Obviously not a threat. U-151 stopped it, sent a boarding party over, said, all right, everybody out, get to your lifeboats, we'll give you time to do it, but we're sinking this vessel. Now, the Germans did not have to do this. Prior to this, in 1917, the Germans announced unrestricted submarine warfare, which meant they could sink anything in a well-publicized restricted zone, okay? In the North Atlantic, around England, anything entering that restricted zone, whether neutral or not, they could sink without warning. Generally, especially the less experienced commanders that came over here, were very nice when they sunk the ships, okay? Most of them were boarded and then sunk, and provisions were given to crews unless they deemed it was going to be a threat. So they stopped the Wiley, sent a boarding party over, and while the German boarding party was still over there, they spotted another vessel, the Jacob M. Haskell. A little bit bigger, more mass. So they left a German boarding party on the other submarine, on the other ship. The crew had all the time to get their stuff, board their lifeboats. They went in to stop this one and then came back for the others later on. But when these guys were interviewed by a newspaper later on, they complained about the boarding officer being obnoxiously nice, that they got on their nerves. So the actual code is up there, that they were so polite, he almost got on their nerves. Each seaman was armed with 2 automatic revolvers and a long, vicious-looking knife. They were not armed with 2 automatic revolvers. They were armed with a single P04 naval Luger. You generally see, I guess because people weren't used to semi-automatic weapons, everybody always says revolvers when you're reading logs and reports. In this case, it's Lugers. A long, vicious-looking knife. They had a sail cutter, and they had another knife, which I have pictured here. You can see this is a long, vicious-looking knife. It's more like a bayonet. You can't see his naval Luger, but you know he has one because of this here. The naval equipment kept 2 magazines across your chest like that. So they let those guys out. They sunk them also. Then 2 hours later, came across the Edward Cole. Again, they found coal in it. The Edward Cole thought that this was the US Navy stopping them. And that's something that you see a lot in this early period, in that they thought it was naval reservists having fun with them. And they must have had experience in the past. You saw the caliber of guys that are going for the sub chasers. So a lot of these guys would see the submarine and think it was either American. Some thought that the big U cruiser looked like a very low destroyer, and they thought it was an American patrol. So they were hesitant to really, not that they could outrun it, but they were hesitant to report them. And again, they left port with radio signals saying no submarine, no war warning. So we have 3 sunk in a matter of a few hours right now. 2 hours later, U-151 spots the Texel, 3,000 tons or so it's much bigger, but again, small compared to modern vessels. Carrying sugar from Puerto Rico to New York, that's considered a war asset. U-151 fired warning shots to get the vessel to stop. Captain ignored them. He started zigzagging per procedure. You had different zigzagging patterns that all these captains were issued with. And finally, the 3rd warning shot, they used high explosive, which exploded over the bridge, sent shrapnel down. That got them to stop. The captain of the Texel complained to the Navy saying, hey, I zigzagged, it got me nowhere. And he refused to admit that he stopped because of the 3rd shot. He said he only stopped because there was a 2nd submarine that he personally observed. There wasn't. The wireless operator did at least send a signal out, which U-151 intercepted. They found submarine survivors from the Wiley and reported them. So now U-151 knew that Americans were probably going to be coming out. If you were stopped by U-151 on this day, this is Friedrich Korner. He was the prize officer. He would have been the one talking to you, inspecting your papers. He spoke perfect English. That was the guy that was so polite it got on everybody's nerves. This is the 15-centimeter deck gun, 6-inch or so. That's what the warning shots would have been used. And usually this is what the vessels would have been sunk with. They really didn't use torpedoes unless they absolutely had to. And the deck gun, again, it could shoot, it was effective at 9 miles. You could engage vessels way beyond where a torpedo could go and fire very quickly. It's a quick firing gun. This right here is what's called Sprengpatronen, which just means explosive cartridge. They were bombs. So if you weren't being sunk by a deck gun, like the sailing ships, this was typically used. They would tell everybody to get off, and they would put those bombs on it, and they would blow you up. The reason we have a picture of this is from the U.S. Navy. One didn't go off when U-151 was in Baltimore. I mean, in the Chesapeake. And we captured it, so that's how we knew what they were using. This is a prize crew. I know I showed you this already. You have Japanese officers here and a bunch of civilians. This isn't from a submarine. This is from a ship called the SMS Voth that was operating in the Indian Ocean. It was an auxiliary cruiser, but they operate under the same principle. If you were in a threat, they were going to stop you, tell everybody to get off. In this case, they actually kept prisoners that they were responsible for feeding and whatnot. So 2 hours after the other vessel was sunk, U-151 came across the Carolina. And this is all off the waters of Atlantic City, by the way. Fired warning shots at her. This was a passenger liner coming from Puerto Rico. It ran a route from Puerto Rico up to New York City. It was carrying sugar. The captain also zigzagged, turned away, ignored warnings, didn't stop. U-151 kept firing, and the radio operator in U-151 wired them a message saying, "You don't wireless, we don't shoot." That's what got them to actually stop. Now, the picture on the left is obviously not from 1918. The reason I included that is the 15-centimeter guns on U-151, on U-117, and the U-cruisers had fantastic German optics. This is one of them. Every gun had 2 of these. This is a 15-power Zeiss telescopic sight. Has 4 different shades in it for night vision, for night firing. It is really excellent even today. The picture there doesn't look so great because I took it during a nor'easter during on Sandy Hook. So I had spray, I had wind, but I just want to illustrate what they would see. So that was effective for 9 miles. That's 5 miles out from Gunnison Beach. I wasn't naked. This was in the winter. I'm sorry, it was in September, but I wasn't naked. There was nobody there during the nor'easter. The Port Said, which is here, that was one of the vessels that U-151 encountered on the way across the ocean that did radio, and the United States ignored it. So that's 9,000 tons. This is 165,000 tons. Okay. It would look smaller, but again, the optics are very incredible. That's like I said, in the middle of a storm with spray coming at me, clouds, wind, and it still looks pretty excellent. Well, where did we go? This is commonly said to be U-151. It's not. This is U-157. But if you were on the Carolina, again, a liner, this is what you would have seen when they stopped you. This is a Spanish liner, the Infanta Isabel de Bourbon. It was a Spanish vessel going from Spain to South America. U-157 stopped it by the Azores, boarded it. This event, I mean, you could write a whole book just about this event, but I bring it up because if you were a passenger on the Carolina and you stopped, this is exactly what you would have been looking like. And I think it's important to visualize it, how terrifying it must have been for these people seeing these 2 15-centimeter guns, which would have been pointed at the vessel at the time. Yes. Yeah. Submarine board. That is a great question. Yes. So on that table over there, I have posters for free. Please take them. I'm tired of carrying them around with me. But one has a blueprint for the U-151 class. Underneath the deck here, they had a dinghy. So you have on the top of the submarine here, you have a wooden deck. That's not the top of the submarine. You have another surface here where you have, they would have a boat under it. They would store their ammo within the deck. They called them asparagus beds. So they had big, 6-inch rounds. So you had a shell about yo big, and they kept them in the deck for easy access. They called them asparagus beds because they were all vertical like that. So even though it's like the top of the submarine, there's actually compartments all in here, and that's where the boat was. Besides that, when they would stop a vessel, they would tell them, send a boat over with an officer and your papers so we can inspect them. And if it was neutral, they would let it go. One U-117 later on in this, well, I'm not going to talk about all the things U-117 sunk, but they stopped a Swedish neutral vessel with orders to go to Sandy Hook. Now, Otto Drescher, the commander of U-117, knew that this is going to be used for war. It was going to Sandy Hook. The only thing at Sandy Hook was the military, but they convinced him otherwise. He basically said, "Don't do it again, because if we catch you again in these waters, we're gonna destroy you." But they sent a boat over in that case and had to listen to the Germans arguing for about an hour on whether or not they're going to sink it. So once the Carolina was stopped, the passengers naturally started panicking. We see a big submarine with big guns there. U-151 said, "All right, everybody get off." Gave it plenty of time, but people went nuts. Like you hear about the panic on the Titanic in the last hours. Jumping into lifeboats, causing them to break. People died just trying to get off, and there was no need to. When the commander of U-151 checked in with the captain of Carolina saying, "Hey, make sure, is everybody off, because we're going to sink this now?" He said, "Yeah, everybody's off." Well, the Germans still on it, found a stoker. They would have been, shoveling coal, still on it. So the Germans like, "We're not going to sink this with one of your guys in." They commanded one of the lifeboats to go back to the ship. Now, propaganda was so effective at the time that those passengers that were being commanded to go back to the ship in their lifeboat thought they were going to be machine gun in the water. Obviously, they weren't. They picked up the stoker. They were on their way, and we're actually complimenting von Knossos after. But as much as the Germans went out of the way to ensure people survived, there were still casualties, and this is true for a lot of vessels that were sunk, not from this incident specifically, but from the effects afterward. So I mentioned it here on the bottom. One of the 13 lives that were lost was a Puerto Rican woman. She couldn't swim. She survived because she was clinging onto the life vest of her dead fiance, and that's how they found her. Her life, she was on a lifeboat, but heading toward Atlantic City, a storm hit and it capsized, and that's how a lot of victims of these U-boats happened off the North American coast, not directly from combat. So U-151 got back to Germany July 20th, cruised 11,000 nautical miles, and sunk 24 vessels, sinking about 60,000 tons. Again, about doubling what Admiral Sims said to expect. And Black Sunday, specifically off New Jersey, 6 of those vessels were sunk, 14,517 tons, and 13 lives lost, all from the Carolina. Okay? The Germans thought this was great. Not that the lives were lost, but that they realized that the vessels they were sinking were transporting coal, were transporting food, and transporting material. This was everything they were going after because they saw firsthand the effects of a naval blockade on Germany. They couldn't feed their population. They couldn't get raw materials in. They wanted to inflict that on the United States, which was the strongest industrial base at the time that was supplying the Allies with food, with ammunition. They knew that the rail system was supplying all this, and it was ending at terminals where these were boarded on sailing ships. That's what they were trying to stop it. They realized there weren't enough sub-chasers. There was almost no destroyers. There was no convoy system, no seaplanes flying surveillance, no minefields, no nets. So von Knossos got back and said, "Look, this is great. This is like a turkey shoot when we go over there." They had planned to send more, but the Germans were really impressed with what they discovered over there. When others came, they kept questioning captains, saying, give us maps of the minefields. Where are the mines? There were no mines. Do you know why? Anybody want to guess why there are no minefields? It's really obvious. It's like stupidly obvious. Yeah, they were worried about, well, they were worried about their own vessels getting sunk. The United States output, we were building 1.43 ships for every one sunk. And we had so many ships going to Europe that they knew minefields would just obstruct traffic, and they didn't want the embarrassment of having American mines sinking these vessels. So there were none. Here, Sims said, we're not going to warn anybody. They're not going to do much damage. It was wound up being quite the opposite. In New York, the police commissioner said we have to black out the city. He wasn't afraid of U-boat attacks. He was afraid of an aerial attack launched by a U-boat or a Zeppelin, but they knew the Germans were now coming. Ports finally closed. Insurance skyrocketed, or if you could get underwritten at all. And now everybody saw submarines when there was nothing there. They thought there were as many as 5 operating at once just because of the range of U-151. There was only one, and everybody said, all right, there's secret bases in Mexico, the Caribbean, New York. They thought they saw them being constructed in Brooklyn. A lot of panic. I just put a picture here just to illustrate why a blackout's important. And we didn't do this in World War II that often either. Because you could track the backlit vessels by using the city lights. In World War II, we didn't do this in Asbury Park, Atlantic City, because they were afraid of losing tourist revenue. New York did do it. But again, the police commissioner of New York said to do that. The government wasn't saying to do that. And after the war, William Sims, in his memoir, Victory at Sea, lambasted the police commissioner for doing that. What a jerk. What an idiot. That was stupid. Why did he do that? Well, we learned our lesson later on. So now for the few people that have heard about U-117 and Sandy Hook. U-117 was not the next submarine to visit this area. After U-151, there was U-156. It actually sunk the USS San Diego with mines in the Long Island Sound. Then came U-140 and U-117 at the same time. U-117 was a UE-2 mine layer. Supposed to sow various minefields across the U.S. East Coast, and it was loaded with bigger mines than the Teca mines that were on U-151. So U-117 was going to approach Nova Scotia and then work its way down to New York City, New Jersey, all the way down to South Carolina. Had 42 UC-200 mines, which you see pictured here. These could not be launched through torpedoes. U-117 had chutes in the back of the submarine, so it could just drop them as they were submerged, and they mapped them as they went. It made it to New York, to the Long Island Sound, south of Fire Island, on August 12th. Okay, so this is a month after U-156 made it. And by the way, after U-151, we actually did start issuing warnings. This is the crew here. This is the weather U-117 encountered while going across the ocean. It was very bad, and it continued when it got to New York. So when it got to New York, it encountered extremely foggy conditions. They were on the surface. They heard foghorns, but they couldn't see anything. Then they ran into the Norwegian ship, the Sommerstad. They couldn't resist at this point. They lost a lot of targets on the way. They attacked the Sommerstad with a single torpedo, and it hit. The Sommerstad claimed that the Germans were using remote control torpedoes because they said they saw the torpedo pass and then do a U and then hit the Sommerstad. They weren't doing this. The United States Navy did that. They programmed the gyroscopes, or they set the gyroscopes to do U's for training so that when they fired duds, they would come back, they could recover them easier. The Germans considered a U to be a gyroscopic fall. This was never the intention, but it caused a lot of controversy at the time because they thought, wow, the Germans really, they're out of this world. When the Sommerstad was sunk, Fort Hancock again lost a lot of its cannons, kept smaller ones that were actually better suited to firing at vessels and submarines. Never in the war did we use them against submarines. However, they were filed regularly for training exercises, ordnance testing at the proving grounds. But when the Somerset went down, they weren't firing at the time. That was going to change the following day. The following afternoon, so this is now a day after the Somerset was sunk. We know a submarine's here. We're not really sure where it is. Locals heard firing between 3 and 4 p.m. Lasted at intervals 3 to 6 shots, intervals of 10 to 15 minutes. People were concerned. Others just said, you know what, this is just normal firing practice. We hear this stuff all the time. And that was acceptable at the time. There was an article in the Asbury Park Press bringing it up, and they said, it's nothing. It's just test firing. There's one of the cannons at Battery Gunnison right now. This is what you would have seen, 6-inch guns like this. This wasn't at Battery Gunnison at the time. Did I write what's on there? Yeah, it was at Battery. This one was located at Battery Peck at the time. Now it's at the nude beach guarding the bathers. What's unique about this sketch here, this is a hand-drawn sketch from U-117's commander. U-151 laid mines in this area, U-156 in this area. U-117 was supposed to lay mines right here at the entrance to the harbor by Sandy Hook. And you notice here, he hand wrote Sandy Hook, okay? The only German submarine to actually note Sandy Hook. And I believe the reason Sandy Hook wasn't attacked was, or mined, why the New York Harbor wasn't mined was because of the firing that Drescher heard from Sandy Hook on the 13th. He doesn't mention it in his logs, but he didn't mention a lot of things in his logs that you learn later from other memoirs of the crewmen. I believe he heard this because U-117 really wasn't sure where they were after sinking the Somerset. It was very foggy. They actually submerged to the bottom to sort of wait out the weather. They reemerged 12 miles off Lavalette. It was still somewhat foggy, but they were actually get their bearings. Now they knew where they were. They abandoned Sandy Hook. Forget about that minefield. We're going to skip to the next one. We're going to go down to the Barnegat Inlet. We're going to lay mines there. So Sandy Hook was doing their drills. U-117 is now in Lavalette, heading towards Barnegat Bay. At around the same time, a British vessel, the Pyrrhus, claimed she was in an engagement with a submarine, believed to be U-117. She said that we fired 75 shells at this submarine. We depth charged it. We managed to destroy 2 torpedoes or get them off their track. Everybody believed this was the same vessel, the same submarine that sunk the Somerset the day before. There was nothing there. And this is the problem when you say there's no submarines, then there are, and then you say, well, now they're this way, now they're here. They started seeing submarines everywhere. There was nothing here. Now, this had a huge effect on what happened the rest of the day. So now this is saying we're being attacked, we're being attacked. They would send allo, allo messages, they called them. It's firing at stuff. So the patrols, which were reactive, we never had active patrols. They would sort of respond when there was an incident. Now we're sending everything out to south of Fire Island, to Long Island Sound, basically, to hunt the submarine that the Pyrrhus is claiming she was attacking. And this is the result, okay? This is the Frederick R. Kellogg. It's a tanker. It's in dazzle camouflage. U-117 said they saw a deck gun on it. It generally, if you saw, we see it's armed in the logs, it meant they were going to fire a torpedo at it. They weren't going to give people time to get off. So this was a dazzle camouflage tanker. U-117 said there was a deck gun on it. It was measured. There wasn't one on it. And it had a local guy. Here you have Cubberley. He was Chester Cubberley. He went to Rutgers. He quit to become a reservist. And he was on that tanker. He died almost instantaneously. He drowned in his cabin. It went down so fast. So it sank within 5 minutes. 7 men died. Cubberley, another naval personnel, Stillman, and other guys in the engine room. Drescher generally would have laid the minefield first. In fact, his superiors criticized him for not being aggressive enough. He saw this tanker, he just had to get it. They delayed the minefield laying in order to do this. There was no patrols around. Everybody was in New York looking for the submarine that the Purists claimed was attacking that didn't exist. The survivors from the Kellogg actually made it up to Sandy Hook. They got in their lifeboat and rowed all the way back up to Sandy Hook, and that's where they were deposited. By the time this attack happened, U-117 laid a minefield in Barnegat Inlet. It had results later on. But once they realized this vessel went down and realized everybody was in the wrong spot, we sent destroyers and subchasers out from Philadelphia to intercept the submarine. But the news was so late, all the patrols that were supposed to be there were in New York. By the time it came from Philadelphia to here, there was nothing there. And in fact, they managed not to hit any of the mines either. So after the war, 3 months later, the armistice is signed. The Asbury Park Press releases another article saying, "Did the daring U-boat shell Sandy Hook?" Okay. Now we remember they reported on the firing at Sandy Hook the day of this attack and said, it was just they're doing tests, they're firing ordnance, whatnot. Now that the war is over, confidential advisors told reporters that, hey, that firing you heard wasn't us. It was U-117. It put its anchor down 50 feet away from the Coast Guard station on the north end of the Hook, which the Coast Guard station is still there. Started firing at it, and then the other guns you heard was Fort Hancock firing back. That myth stuck. And that's one of the first things I investigated when I started pulling logs. And this was revisited even again in 2018. Still talking about this. Now, both these articles left a lot of details out that we find from records within Sandy Hook. During Fort Hancock in World War I, well, within Fort Hancock during World War I, excuse me, there were no fewer than 6 close calls from friendly fire. An officer was nearly decapitated by anti-aircraft. A 6-inch shell misfired, went through a tent, missed a soldier by 10 foot. Fragment hit an occupied tent in Battery Granger. And another one landed in near the guardhouse. On August 13th, specifically, the Army reported that several shells, some as big as 10 inches, impacted at various points on the Fort Hancock reservation. Barracks and other structures occupied by the troops had been endangered. Colonel Brady, who had replaced Colonel Harris as the commanding officer of Sandy Hook Defenses, called these incidents to the attention of his superiors. When asked for an explanation, Colonel William A. Phillips of the Proving Ground reported that his people took every reasonable precaution, but Fort Hancock is in dangerous proximity to the proof battery. Premature explosions or other incidents were impossible to foresee or control. So now that the war is over, you could say, hey, these accidents we had, these people that got hurt, it wasn't us, it was a U-boat, but it was us. U-117 stayed well away from that area. Later on, toward Cape May into Delaware, we have the memoir of the chief engineer of U-117. They saw shipyards, they wanted to shell them, and Otto Drescher said, no, we will never shell civilian shipyards because we are the gentlemen that the British like to refer to themselves as. Does not mean other U-boats didn't do it. U-156 did. U-156 that came before U-117, they shelled Provincetown in like the Martha's Vineyard area. Sunk a lot of vessels there, shelled it. Other U-cruisers had orders to shell factories and stuff like that. It didn't happen. But U-17 wasn't one of them. So, as if the events at Sandy Hook that day weren't embarrassing enough, only 5 U-boats actually reached North America. There were more coming. The war ended before they could get here. However, the ones that did make it sunk 92 vessels, accounting for basically 175,000 tons and 133 lives lost. Almost no resistance. Almost. We almost got 2 of them. We could talk about that if we have time, but we'll see. U-117 was one of them. But otherwise, they were completely unopposed. The panic they caused that the Navy was trying to avoid by not issuing war warnings. So after U-151 left, they said, all right, now we have to tell people this happened. Now, before U-156 made it, people were so panicked that you had vessels hugging the coast, grounding themselves, colliding with each other. So the figure of 133 lives lost that summer goes up to 435 lives lost, including sub-chasers that were sunk by American destroyers and battleships, because the sub-chasers sort of looked like a service U-boat from a distance. Submarines that were attacked. So the passive effect of this was much greater than what the U-boats actually did. But the United States didn't see it that way. William Sims, again, you could read this in Victory at Sea, and you could read it in the testimony after the war because he had to testify to Congress along with Secretary Daniels, claimed that this was a minor incident of the war. I mean, it was a 3-month period. I'll give him that. But the U-cruisers were the least harmful of any of the German types. They were of no great military importance. I mentioned the USS Ticonderoga here. That was an auxiliary cruiser sunk by U-152. U-152 was one of the ones that was on its way over here. U-152 fought the Ticonderoga on the surface with its deck guns and killed a lot of people and left a lot of people in the water. Sims didn't mention that after the war. So I said only 24 of 237 sailors surviving, including 2 officers, which were taken aboard U-152 and brought back to Germany. However, in 1942, when the Germans returned, they sunk about a little over 150,000 tons of shipping in 2 months. This was considered a tragedy, and we had to completely reassess U.S. naval policy. But we had in World War I, to give credit of the nascent sub-chaser force and the Navy at the time, they were really coming into their own stride by the end of the war, especially with listening devices, hydrophones, tactics. But hubris from the officers in the U.S. Navy led us to pretty much forget every lesson that we had learned that summer. And now much more people died in World War II, and that's mostly what you hear about. So now I can answer questions because I'm sure there'll be a lot of them. I usually run out of time before we can answer the questions. Go ahead.
Submarine warfare technology? At the beginning of World War I?
No, not at the beginning of World War I. I would say the British were probably ahead of the Germans at the beginning of World War I. You had U-1, U-3. Well, U-1 was already gone. U-3, these were very primitive. And the intention of submarines in 1914, before the war, was not how they wound up being used. They were supposed to really guard coastlines as a surprise attack. They weren't intended to go out on their own and go hunting like this. That all changed. During the course of the war, the Germans went way beyond what the British and Americans did, but not at the beginning of the war, no. Yeah. Yes. A colleague of mine wrote a whole book about it called The Killing Shore, just off of New Jersey. U-123. Same, you could see U-123 is the one you most hear about because it basically followed U-117. It went to New York. U-123 surfaced in New York Harbor because there was no blackout, so his crew could see the lights of New York, and they destroyed a lot of vessels. They actually ran out of torpedoes. That's the only reason he turned back. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Survivable fuel and food. Did they have a fueling station?
No, that's a question I get all the time. Diesel. But so the cargo submarines had a range of 25,000 nautical miles, which is a crazy number. It was less for U-139 and U-117, but they had enough fuel if they were constructed correctly, which they weren't. To make it over here, work patrol for a month or so, and then come back. The U-151 class could go much longer. They had water evaporators to make their own water. But they pretty much relied, the fuel wasn't a problem if it wasn't leaking, but they relied on capturing vessels for their food supply. So that was a big deal. Every time they stopped a vessel, the first thing they did was go after the food. And that included bringing on livestock. A lot of these sailing vessels had livestock, whether it be pigs or goats. They sunk a lot of fishing vessels. They would take the fish. They were so excited to get American butter because they had American butter, cigarettes, coffee, because in Germany they had blockades, so it was all ersatz. It was all bad substitutes. They sunk a ship full of cigars. They lost their mind. They thought it was the best thing because they were smoking cigarettes and cigars with beechwood. That's the leaves they were using for them. Yeah.
When I was in the late 40s, early 50s, my dad used to go fishing on the south side of San Diego. We had to have a license from the military to do it. And I remember playing, and they were like cement blockhouses, maybe 2 or 3 of them along those beaches.
Mhm.
They had little slits.
Yeah.
Were they built from?
2. The pillboxes, you mean by the fishing?
Yeah.
World War II, I believe. I'm pretty sure. Go ahead.
The difference in size between World War II type U-boats and World War I.
No, they're about the same. The Type 7s, the most common World War II U-boat, was based off of these, almost identical. Those are UBs. These were one of the smaller of the German submarines. This is the UB type. They were intended for coastal operations. There were different U classes throughout it, some which were quite large. The U-81 class, I believe, had the length of this, but not the girth. So World War I ones were a bit bigger in general. And if you exclude the milk cows of World War II, which were what they used to resupply U-boats with fuel for going long distances and long patrols. Yep.
Yeah, I'm just curious, in the Second World War was the Kriegsmarine, and one sub had SMU.
Yes, okay. SM stands for Seiner Majestät, His Majesty. Okay, so in World War I, it was the Kaiserliche Marine, the Imperial Navy. The Kriegsmarine in World War II just meant War Navy. And in the nomenclature changed in World War II, even on the surface vessels. So if you had, let's say, SMS Emden, a cruiser, Seiner Majestät's Schiff, His Majesty's Ship Emden. In World War II, it was KMS, Kriegsmarine Schiff, whatever it was, Bismarck, let's say. Yep.
During the Great War, what capabilities did the Coast Guard have for anti-submarines?
None really. I talk about the Coast Guard in the book a bit because during World War I, during these naval spending plans, they changed they moved the Coast Guard from being under the Department of Commerce to the Department of the Navy, but they really didn't do much as far as patrolling goes. That was left to the naval districts, to the sub chasers, and the limited destroyers we had in seaplanes like that. And like I said, they were sort of reactive. I personally am critical of the way we operated in that we had a lot of sub chasers that were equipped with 3 different hydrophones. So we made the sub chasers because they were wooden, they were cheap, we could build them quickly, we could build a lot of them. We never really used them for patrols. They were a bit slow, but in my opinion, and I'm not in the Navy, I believe we should have had all of them out on the coastline running patrols, and then if they encountered something, radioing it, and then the destroyers could come out. As it was, they were very reactive. We developed what were called hunting squadrons. So an incident like the Frederick R. Kellogg happens, okay? Now the Naval District dispatches a hunting squadron of a destroyer, sub chasers, whatever, to go find it after the fact. And the destroyers, which were very much faster than the sub chasers, had to slow their speed so that the sub chasers could keep up with. So by the time they got to these places, most of the U-boat was gone. U-117, I did a presentation in Philadelphia on the USS Olympia about this. U-117 got in a big battle with sub chasers and was nearly sunk in the Delaware Bay. The only reason it was sunk, it was almost sunk, was that the Navy had already been doing drills in the area with sub chasers and submarines. So U-117 attacked the vessel. It went inland into shallow water where it didn't think U-117 could go and started radioing like crazy. The sub chasers were already there. So the sub chasers responded. They had seaplane support even. U-117 submerged. It thought it was foggy again too, like it was with the Somerset. U-117 had no idea the sub chasers were there and attacking him. The seaplane saw it, and when U-117 submerged, the seaplane shot rounds into the water, marking where the submarine was because it could see it from above. The sub chasers dropped their depth charges, and they saw oil coming to the surface and bubbles. And they left. Well, U-117, U-140 left Germany with severe fuel bunker leaks. There was always a trail of oil. The reason they saw bubbles was because a week before, one of the compressed air lines in U-117 broke, and he knew it broke because when he was using the periscope, he could see bubbles. So the faults of the submarine saved them. U-140 encountered a destroyer, the USS Stringham. Same thing. USS Stringham launched depth charges. It saw an oil slick the size of a football field, and so we got him and left. But the submarine was just leaking fuel, and it had been. So those were the only 2 times we almost got a U-boat here and never finished the job. Yeah, so this is the gun sight I was showing before. I just asked that you don't touch it. I'm still paying it off. I have some medals here from the United States. They're not naval ones. I have a U-boat badge, an Iron Cross, a wound badge, a piece of U-117 that at a shipyard, a dock worker cut off because we got U-117 after the war. We tested it and then we sunk it in military exercises. So whoever was working on that cut off. It's for the oil cooler, the data plate. He cut that off. I have some posters over there and bookmarks. Feel free to take what you want. And if anybody is interested in the book, I have some copies for sale. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you very much. I am. I live in Sayreville.
You know where Henry Hudson's home is?
Mm-hmm.
Been to kind of across the way?
No.